And now we're recording. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Arka.
Thank you. Thanks for coming today. Today we'll be talking about moving lights and cameras for better 3D perception. I'd like to start by thanking my committee members, my advisor Chris, who is joining us remotely. Srinivas and Oliver are here. Andy and Christoph are also joining us remotely. Okay, so let's get started. We need high quality data to build good world models. And good world models are indispensable for robotics and computer vision tasks. On the top, we see the Research Institute robot roaming around in a supermarket aisle. It needs good world models to figure out how to interact with the objects on the aisle, how to interact with the rest of the world. On the right, we see the fruitlets robot, which is roaming around in an orchard. It also needs a good world model to figure out how to interact with the plants in the orchard and how to pick fruits. On a more computer vision note, if you are a big box store, you might want to invest in a capture system to create digital twins for all the products in your catalog so that you can better inform the buyers. If you're interested in virtual reality, I don't need to emphasize the need for having very high quality models of the objects for a more immersive 3D experience. To generate high quality world models, we need very sophisticated capture systems. Let us start by looking at some human scale capture systems. On the left, we are looking at the classical capturing president in 3D project led by Devovic and colleagues, where they imaged President Obama with 8 cameras, illuminated his face with 50 lights, and had 2 laser scanners on the standby to fill out extra data. Devovic and colleagues then went on to make this gigantic capture rig consisting of 90 cameras, illuminated the scene with 330 lights, and had 24 active stereo pairs to capture geometric and photometric data for photorealistic volumetric videos. Finally, not very far from here, Lex Fridman and Mark Zuckerberg had to sit in a large capture rig consisting of 110 cameras, illuminated the scene with 460 lights, and there every single gesture of their face was captured at 90 Hertz using complicated illumination policies to generate the data that was used to make this impressive video demonstration. In short, stationary capture systems, which are designed to capture human beings, require a significant amount of hardware to capture high-quality multimodal data. However, the requirements for robotics are a little bit different, where portability takes precedence over the number of modalities captured and the quality of data captured. For an example, we'll look at the Aloha platform, which is tasked to learn everyday manipulation tasks from demonstration, and it images the world using 3 RGBD cameras, and it records a bunch of kinesthetic demonstration using 2 student-teacher robot arm pairs mounted on a robot base. Another more portable example is the data capture system for grasping in the wild and the follow-up work universal manipulation interface by Song and colleagues, where the researchers paired a single RGBD camera with a handheld ensemble of gripper and data logging and display systems. And this system was good enough to capture data and train manipulation models. Another important example of a field-deployed robot is this robot platform designed and developed by the AII-RA consortium here in Carnegie Mellon and other related schools, where the researchers designed and deployed a custom camera light system mounted on a robot platform into fields of Iowa to image and run diagnostics on corn and soybean plants. All these systems are designed to be portable and very robust, which comes at the cost of the quality of the data and the number of modalities captured. Our research is motivated by the following question. In this continuum, there is a trade-off where when we focus on the number of modalities captured, we sometimes sacrifice the portability and vice versa. Is there a middle ground where we can trade off between the portability of high quality and more modalities data captured with some sensing system? We'll look at a few examples which tries to achieve this middle ground, and I hope to convince you that moving cameras and lights can be surprisingly effective to this effect. We'll break the project down, and we'll break this thesis down into 3 independent projects. In the first part of the talk, we will look at what can be gained by moving lights around the robot's workspace, following which we will look at what can be gained by moving cameras mounted on a robot. And finally, we'll look at a project where we moved lights and cameras together. This is a brief overview of the talk. By now, hopefully you are motivated to learn more about what can be gained by moving lights and cameras. We'll next move on to a project where we describe the effects of moving lights in the form of a robot workspace scale photometric stereo rig. By the way, it's okay if the talk is interactive. Please feel free to stop me and ask questions, and we can have an interactive version. Yes, please.
For the last one, removing the cameras and the lights, how is that not just a portable system?
How is that not a portable system?
Yeah, but you said it's in the middle, but it seems very much like the portable one, right?
So Oliver asked the question, when we are moving the cameras and lights and the last project, how is that not a portable system? Yes, that is a portable system in the spectrum of the stationary system that we discussed and the robot mounted system, but that's the spectrum we are trying to fill in. So it is less portable than, say, a handheld camera. We will draw the parallel at the end of the talk where I will show how you can be more portable. Does that answer the question? All right. Okay. So let's look at what we can gain by moving lights. Moving lights can highlight local and global surface properties. So if I just showed you this video, where I say that we are looking at a piece of aluminum and the light is moving in the plane of the camera. Depending on your knowledge of how aluminum reflects light, you'll be able to tell immediately that there is a curvature on the plate without even seeing the whole image. If I just showed you this picture of my wall, and I said that the light is held parallel to the camera, perpendicular to the surface, you cannot tell that much. However, when I move the light and place it in a grazing angle of incidence, the cracks and features on the wall become immediately more prominent. Low angle of incidence or grazing illumination can highlight high spatial frequency cracks and features, whereas moving directional illumination can highlight low spatial frequency, such as curvature of the surface. We wanted to see how this observation can be used for robot manipulation. And to do that, we designed and developed a robot workspace scaled photometric stereo system. At the core, we have 6 lights on the table and 1 light on the top of the workspace, and every single perception instance is a set of 7 images, captured 1 light at a time. This gives us a per pixel shadow map and 6 multi-illumination images, and we pre-calculate a simple Lambertian shading model, or the L-dot shading model, and we use that along with the shadows to get an initial estimate of what the surface geometry is. We also recognize that the image that we capture is not only due to the direct illumination, but also due to the lights bouncing off the wall, the room illumination, the presence of the robot, etc. We digest all these higher order effects using a truncated spherical harmonic model for every single light. And with the initial estimates of the normals and shadows, we can run a simple nonlinear least squares to get per pixel measurements of normals, which we can optionally integrate to get surface depth because our workspace is calibrated. So what can we do with such a perception system? Well, let us look at this task of picking this curious looking pyramid up. This pyramid has to be picked up using a vacuum gripper. And as you can see, there is only one surface against which a vacuum gripper would seal. To identify that, we need to know which surface does not have any depth edges and what is the orientation of that surface so that we can approach and pick it. These are 2 quantities which our system measures natively. We natively measure the location of depth edges, and we also natively measure the orientation of surfaces. So we can use that information to send that information to the robot, and the robot just goes and executes a very simple policy to pick the object up. I should point out that, this video is played in real time. We didn't speed it up. Okay, now let's look at a different example where we pick up camouflaged objects. So we are in a room with a carpeted floor. If you drop a tiny screw on the carpeted floor and it matches very well with the texture of the carpet, you cannot see it immediately. So what you would do, you would get down on your knees and pull out your phone flashlight and see where the shadows are. We wanted to ask the question, can this effect be used for robotic manipulation? To do that, we took a thin disc of plastic, which was so thin that it could not be reliably estimated by the depth sensor, and we painted it with random texture on the foreground and background so that you cannot segment out with color. But when we shine low angular incidence illumination, it casts shadows, and that is an important signal that we use to localize the object and go and pick it up. Another example is measurement of bending deformation. Since we have a really accurate perception system, what we can do is we can track change of shape. So to observe that, we performed the following experiment. We took a card and we forced the card against a table to induce buckling deformation. We knew that the card was flat to begin with. So at every single time step, we ran our perception pipeline and we tried to estimate the shape. What we are showing here on the right is the shape of the card overlaid on the captured data. We also take 3 snapshots of the geometry and show them as a mesh in the rendered mesh below. Our approach
And this is still doing photometric stereo.
Yes, it is still doing photometric stereo.
For each camera's position and object position, you have a bunch of lights, and then you change the object deformation, you do it again, and that's okay.
Srinivas asked
It's
the
not
question.
like a video.
No, it's not. So Srinivas asked the question, did we do that? Did we make this result work on video, or was it periodic images that was taken as the object was deforming? The answer is, it is periodic images that was taken when the object was deforming. Okay, so our approach for measuring the deformation was about 70% more precise than the closest learned baseline, and we present more quantitative details in our thesis and our papers. Okay, now let's look at a summary of this project. We developed a robot workspace.
For the previous example, where were you getting the ground truth for that?
Where was it getting ground truth for this?
That's right, the deformation.
Yes, so for the ground truth, we did not get a ground truth for the real world experiment. We ran a simulated version of this experiment, which had ground truth from the mesh, and we got those numbers from that experiment. We didn't have an accurate enough sensor to get sub-millimeter precise surface measurements on the card as it was deforming. Therefore, there is no ground truth for this experiment, but simulation ground truth is there. Could I answer your question?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So summary of contributions, we developed a robot workspace scale photometric stereo system. We demonstrated a simple pipeline to pick up arbitrary objects with a vacuum gripper. The quality of normals captured by our system surpasses that of commercial sensors. And we also were able to accurately estimate poses of objects and estimate bending deformation. The numerical results for the last 2 claims are not in this talk, but I'm happy to point it to parts of my thesis where we discuss these. Okay, now we know what we can gain by moving lights. Let's look at our project where we moved cameras in the form of a robot-mounted co-located ensemble of sensors. We co-located vision and tactile sensors on a manipulator, and with that, we will present a method to visually servo robots using wrist-mounted cameras, and we'll also present results on localizing contact patches on objects. Before that, let's look at the data that we captured. We captured 2 color image streams from our sensor. One is from the RGB camera on the right, and the other is from the color channel of the depth sensor. We have a depth stream coming from the depth sensor, and at contact, we measure a high resolution contact patch using the gel site sensor. Now, let us take a look at what we can tell from moving cameras. To motivate this, let us look at this example where a robot mounted camera is slowly coming towards an object in its workspace, and a drone is trying to land on the roof of a car. These videos have a qualitative similarity. A part of the world in both of these videos are persistent, and we want to use that information to servo a robot arm. To servo a robot arm, we need a servoing signal, and for that, we predict the heading of the camera in the scene from optic flow. Our algorithm is very simple. We calculate the optic flow between subsequent frames, and we look for a pattern in the optic flow. The minima of that optic flow satisfying certain constraints gives us statistically significant estimates of where the heading is in the scene. I'm projecting estimates of 100 monocolor frame pairs averaged every 10 centimeters on the scene which you just saw to show that it is actually statistically significant. Our algorithm is very simple, and it is inspired by results on visual looming. Visual looming is the concept which biologists use to describe how bees land on flowers and how bees avoid visual threats. So that was a very interesting direction we took to understand what algorithm we should use here. Okay, now that we know where we are headed in the workspace, eventually we'll make contact with the workspace. And we need to figure out a way to accurately measure the contact patch. To do that, we modified the classical gel side sensor as proposed by Yuan and colleagues by adding back a red, green, and blue light. So we have 6 lights in total. We changed the policy of capturing illumination to 1 light at a time imaging. And we also upgraded the image processing pipeline, which let us capture the surface normals and depths with sub-millimeter and sub-10-degree accuracy. Now we have accurate heading estimates, and we also have a high-quality contact patch measurement. As we are moving towards the object, now we need to solve our problem of identifying where we made contact. So when we're moving towards an object, we keep an estimate, a visual estimate of where the object is. At the end of the trajectory, we touch the object and we make a contact. And we can fuse the information that we have so far to identify accurately where we made contact on the object. A summary of our contributions for this project: we demonstrated a robot-mounted color-coded ensemble of vision-based sensors. We also demonstrated a very simple algorithm for visual servoing of robot manipulators using just wrist cameras. And we also demonstrated a precise contact pose estimation using our sensor ensemble. All right. Now we understand what we can gain by moving lights and moving cameras. Let's look at the main part of the talk, where we will discuss a robot-mounted multi-flash stereo camera rig to understand the effects of moving lights and cameras together. For that, we need to motivate the need of moving lights and cameras together. To do that, let us revisit an example we discussed before. The TRI robot, which is fulfilling my order in a supermarket aisle, doesn't get a chance to access the objects on the shelf from behind. It has to work with the model that it can build only from a few frontal views. Same is the case with the fruitlets robot. It is also not capable of wrapping around the orchard and seeing the fruits from behind before deciding how it should approach the object in 3D. The narrow cone of possible viewpoints due to the limited range of robot's motion make the capture and synthesis of photorealistic assets from constrained viewpoints a challenging problem. We want to address this challenging problem. And to do that, we designed and developed a multi-flash stereo camera rig for photorealistic capture. We use this rig to capture data from small scenes and synthesize photorealistic assets. At the core, we have a multi-flash camera, and this is how it works. That is me sitting in front of the camera, wearing a funny wig, and I'm going to show you one capture instance from this rig. That was all the data that we needed for in a single capture instance. So let us look at what we can do with the data. Okay, this needs to mute. Okay, so that is the data that we captured. This is a related textured mesh. We could extract the geometry of the scene, paint it with the texture and some approximate BRDFs, and relight it using a renderer. We could also have a volumetric relighting backend where we use a volumetric renderer and ask it to relight with a subset of training light views. And finally, we can also extract the geometry of the scene. Let's take a look at another example, which is harder for conventional computer vision pipelines. We want to image my wet hand, which has a bunch of water and a bunch of specular details on the hand. It is hard for conventional stereo to figure out what the shape of the object is because of the shiny highlights. Like before, we still capture a stereo pair and 2 channels of multi-flash images. And with that, we can do the following things. We can extract the image, we can extract the color, and we can extract the specularities, and we can use that together to relight it using a mesh renderer. We're using Blender, and as you can see, the wetness of the hand is still very much prevalent. If the specularities need to be removed, we can do that by just visualizing the albedo or the base color of the hand from just the flash images. Let's take a look at another example, which is harder for conventional vision. We're looking at my oily hand. Its oily skin is harder to image because, again, it has many specular highlights here and there. So conventional stereo might fail. Like before, we took an HDR stereo pair, and we also captured 2 channels of multi-flash images. Since we have the light moving in a particular pattern around the camera, we could estimate the location of the specular pixels. And like before, we could also estimate the geometry. I'm sorry for this bar which is blocking. It just says recovered specular tint on mesh. So we could recover the specular tint, and like the geometry is also recovered, so we could paint it on the mesh. And with this, like before, we could do the following things. We took the base color and the specular tint, and we relit that asset. If the base color is, if you don't like the base color, you want the color to change, we can borrow the color from the HDR stereo pair, and we can relight a different tone map image by adding the specular tint and the color from the HDR pair. This is the data that we're capturing every single instance. Okay, that is the video that I already showed. We captured 26 RGB images in the time the camera flashes in front of me. So that was 26 images being captured. What we captured was a left and right HDR stereo pair, and we also captured left and right multi-flash images, 12 of each for every single light. In this slide, I am showing you the tone map versions of the flash images for aesthetic purposes, because the display is not guaranteed to be HD.
So when you say HDR image pair, you're taking multiple exposures?
Yes.
So each set of 12 flashes for each exposure? And how many exposures?
So Srinivas is asking technical details about the HDR, so let me clarify that. So the multi-flash images are single exposure. We have 12 single exposure images. The exposure was about 700 to 800 microseconds. The HDR stereo pair was a stack of 8 exposures from the camera min to the camera max and 8 stops. The dynamic range available for the flash images is the default dynamic range which the sensor has. We did not multi-exposure fuse it, but the stereo pair had exposure fusion. Does that answer the question? Okay.
So the multi-flash images were not HDR?
They are not HDR, no, because that would increase the capture time significantly. Okay, let us look at how we process the captured data. For scenes where we image human faces, we captured those scenes using a 16mm focal lens, and we image the subject from about 400 to 500 millimeters away. We captured a stereo pair. We used deep stereo matching to get surface depth, and we obtained surface normals as gradients of depth. For scenes where we have smaller objects a bit far away from the camera, we used 12mm focal lens, and we imaged them from about 500 millimeters to a meter away. And the rest of the pipeline was similar. We had a stereo pair, we had surface depth from deep stereo, and we had gradient to surface depth to calculate the normals. Apart from depth and normals, we also capture another geometric quantity, which is the depth edges. The task here is to identify which pixels on this mannequin are do have a depth edge. So since you know that this is a wig, there are tiny strands of hair. So it is a good bet if we just say the hair strands of the depth edges. We want to figure it out systematically by looking at the multi-flash images. And when I switch on the flash images, you can immediately see that answering this question is a bit easier. The key insight here is that the intensity changes conditioned on the light direction is strongly correlated with the depth edges on Lambertian objects. Although this is not completely a Lambertian object, Lambertian assumption works out for this case. And this was first figured out by Ramesh Raskar in the classical multi-flash camera paper, and our system qualitatively also performs similarly. I should also point out that these depth edges are just per pixel heat maps. It's just a likelihood of whether that pixel has a depth edge or not. We didn't connect those pixels to extract individual hair strands, although it has been done before in literature. Apart from two geometric quantities, we also capture a photometric quantity, which is the location of non-Lambertian patches in the scene. The way it works is we have a scene with a blend of specular and non-Lambertian and Lambertian objects, and when the light moves, the scene changes qualitatively. What we wanted to figure out is where is the non-Lambertian patch in the object. And to do that, we looked at something called Chandrasekhar invariant for Lambertian objects. What it says is that if the light is moving in a particular pattern around the camera, certain parts of the scene, if they're Lambertian, is not going to change. So we look for changes in Chandrika's invariant, which basically violates that assumption, and that happens to be a good enough per pixel label for non-numbership patches in the scene. So now that we have looked at some of the results, the data that we capture and process, and let us turn our attention to what is going on in the backend. Under the hood, we have a neural radiance field, and I just wanted to take a moment to talk about or give a small primer on that. So the goal of a neural radiance field is to take in a bunch of multi-view images. It has two main parts, moving parts, the geometric network, which is tasked to understand the geometry of the scene, and the photometric network, which is tasked to understand the appearance of the scene. At convergence, this pipeline provides the geometry of the scene as a mesh or another representation, and it also gives us a view interpolator which can be queried with the pose close to the training pose to get an idea of what the scene would look like. And the whole thing is trained using a single loss, which takes care of the geometric and photometric losses, and trained using differential volumetric rendering. Since we have access to some salient data, we are in a position to propose some improvements to this pipeline. So we propose 3 improvements. We want to include metric depth to accelerate the training of the geometric network. There is a single loss which takes care of the geometric and photometric aspects. We want to have more control over the way the loss is calculated, such that we have more control over the training process. And finally, as you are well aware, for successful volumetric rendering, sampling is crucial. We also propose a modification to sampling so that the sampling process is more efficient and the training is faster. With that, let us jump into the details of what the modifications are. We'll start by looking at how we incorporate dense metric depth. And we do that simply by solving this equation, which looks a bit intimidating, but it is doing something very simple. It is fitting a neural surface with metric depth. To do that, we incorporate the estimates of metric depth from stereo. We'd also like the network to approximate a locally smooth surface. To do that, we have this regularizer which enforces that. And to initialize this regularizer, we use the gradients of the depth pre-calculated, and that returns a smoother surface. Finally, for purposes downstream, we would like to have the geometry network understand the scene in form of a signed distance field. And to do that, we need to optimize the iconal equation. As we measure depth from stereo, the approximate nearest neighborhood queries that is required to optimize this iconal equation is very simple for us, and this makes it significantly faster than the state of the art for neural surface fitting. Now let us turn our attention to the loss.
Arka, for that previous equation, with the loss term incorporating information from metric depth, did you have to find a scaling term at all in order to weight how much contribution that was coming?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are you asking about what is the scaling term for the total depth loss in the whole pipeline?
Of the metric depth with respect to the other losses.
Gotcha. So since the depth was metric and the camera poses were metric, because we had access to very good camera motion, all of the there was no scaling that had to be figured out to make this work.
Okay.
But in the context of the whole loss that is required for the optimization, there is a scale which looks at the photometric part and the geometric part, and there is a scale difference in that. So that difference would be about 1 order of magnitude, 0.1 and 1. Did that answer your question?
On which part?
Yeah, so you want the photometric loss to be 1, and we found having the photometric loss to be 1 and the geometric loss to be 0.1 times worked out for us.
Cool.
Could I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay.
Another quick question here, I think more on the visualization. I can see that the normal visualization on the bottom right, the normal, the detail in the normals changes depending on the view. So I assume this is, you visualize here the analytic normals from the depth from the specific viewpoint that is currently being rendered?
So are you talking about the color changing, say, on this part as the view
Yeah.
changes?
Yeah. Or is that an
Uh,
artifact on my zoom? That could also be, but
I don't think we are, so I'm just viewing the normal that is calculated as a gradient of the depth
yep.
in this,
Yep.
but when we use that, we have to pass it through the pose of the camera such that the normals are like not conflicting with each other.
Sure, that's fine. I'm just surprised that there's this there's this detailed pattern in that fabric. I assume that
Yeah.
these little ponies are standing on, and like from some views you can still like see the ripples in that detail, and like from other views you cannot. And so I was just like wondering how you compute those and why that effect is happening.
Yeah, that's a great question. So short answer is that's just noise. So we use deep stereo on the HDR stereo pair. Sometimes it captures it, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, and in the bigger picture, in the bigger scheme of things, you can tune some hyperparameters so that that effect is magnified, which we'll talk about in just one sec. But what you're
Right.
seeing here is just in the noise. Hopefully that
Okay.
was a meaningful answer.
Yep, thanks.
Good. All right. Okay, so if you remember, there was one single loss which was taking care of everything. And why does literature prefer that? Jointly learning shape and gradients is generally advisable because it affords some form of geometric super resolution. For example, on this clay object, if you jointly learn the shape and radiance or shape and appearance, you can recover these tiny surface details. The same is the case with the bird, and we have recovered the sides of the feather. However, this feature can also be a bug, and it can also make problems. Here we are seeing a Coke can lying on a flat Charuko board. We know that Charuko board is flat, but the geometry that we have recovered is definitely not flat. It has some holes in it. Let us take a deeper look at this artifact. To do that, we will reconstruct these two following scenes, where we have a checkerboard on the scene. And the reason why we have a checkerboard is because it constitutes maximum appearance variation, that is black and white side by side, corresponding to minimum geometric variation, that is everything is stuck to a plane. If you're not careful while optimizing the appearance and geometry for this scene, you would end up with a reconstruction which looks like this, which is what a glimpse of what we saw in the previous slide. We would like the geometric reconstruction to look something like this. And we also do not want to sacrifice the learning rate. We want it to convert fast. So our fix for this is really simple. We want to budget gradient updates with depth edges. What I mean by that is for every single training image, we have the location of the pixel location of the depth edges. Now, in the initial part of the training, when the network is not initialized, we would like to focus on learning the easier parts of the scene. That is the parts of the scene which does not have that many depth edges. As the network warms up and we get into a reasonably good local minima, we would start preferentially sampling the harder parts of the scene. That is the parts which have a bunch of depth edges and creases and stuff like that. What this lets us do is it lets us retain a high learning rate throughout the process, and we converge with reasonably good geometry at the end, which does not have holes and weird textures like that. Although this scene doesn't have a checkerboard-like texture, we have significant appearance variation corresponding to geometric variation in the form of the towel on the board. Yes, Oliver.
I was just wondering with the sampling like this, why is it kind of identify like points in a scene? Why is it not like full edges that it's sampling?
So what Oliver is asking is why is the sampling likelihood like points here and why not like just whole edges? So this is an implementation detail, and that is what we are seeing in the figure. So what we do is we have a pixel location of like where the edge is. The geometry is changing the maximum there, but it has some change around it. So what we do is we dilate that part. Now, initially for the flat parts, we don't need to dilate it that much because it is mostly flat. But as we progress the training, we also need to like warm up, like we need to mine the samples very closely to the depth edge. So what you're seeing here is at 85% training progress, but this is the per pixel sampling likelihood. If you were to look at 90%, these dots would become much sharper. If you were to look at 70%, there will be a blend of these dots and background. Was that? Okay, good, thank you.
Again, where did you get the depth and edges from?
The depth edges was from the multi-flash camera. And these are like per pixel labels. So once we have the images registered, everything falls into place.
The texture on the cloth there on the table, is it really depth edges?
So there are some depth edges on the cloth. I wish I brought the cloth here. It is not that much, but there are some depth edges.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Because it picks it up even if it's
Yeah.
small.
So the stereo, if you remember, Christoph asked the question, why is there like, unevenness on the cloth? That was something which the stereo also picked up, but it's a hit and miss. We don't, at the resolution we capture, we don't really reliably capture that. So the question Srinivas asked was, are there depth edges on the towel? The answer is there are, but not very pronounced. Okay, can we move on? Okay. Okay, so now we have the yes.
In the sampling, as you go through training, I would expect that results could maybe differ depending on the scheduling of exactly when you start switching from one mode of sampling to the other. How did you pick that exactly here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the depth edges here is almost binary, where there is a depth edge or there is not a depth edge. So what we do is every single probability of picking a single pixel is a linear blend between if it is a depth edge or not a depth edge, with a temperature term which tracks the progress of the training. So as the training progresses, we start focusing more on the depth edges, but in the initial part of the training, the temperature is low, so we just sample the flatter parts more heavily. That is how we schedule it. It's just a linear schedule.
Okay, and tracking the progress of training, you do that with respect to training steps?
So yes, every single gradient step is a training step.
Okay, cool.
Did you consider starting sort of further on this? Because like the 15% looks like it's sampling a lot from the background in front of the objects.
Yes. So Oliver asks the question, did I look at starting this training a bit later, because this image looks like it is sampling a lot from the background. Sampling a lot from the background, that is expected because that is flat. So that is where we would like to sample, and delaying the start and all. So this is a really frustrating answer, but this is what we figured out. It doesn't matter that much. So you can start this maybe 25% down the line, and the results that you would get is not going to be terribly different than starting it from step 0. But again, I can always come up with a scene which has something which doesn't, follow this simple assumption, and we'll mess the results up. So I just said we started from step 0. Hopefully that was a meaningful answer. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Good. Okay. So now let us look at sampling. We have taken a look at incorporating metric depth in looking at the loss. So we'll look at the sampling. Sampling is important because we want to have a volumetric rendering step to tie the whole thing together. And we want to have a volumetric rendering step because it is great at preserving really thin details in the appearance, even though the explicit representation of the shape that may be a mesh even though it misses it. So our fix to that was, since we estimate the geometry a priori using stereo, and we jointly optimize the geometry and appearance, we are in a position to calculate a shell around our current estimate of the geometry and perform the volumetric integration inside that shell. What that lets us do is it lets us become very sample efficient for this volumetric rendering step, and we converge really fast. Let me show you one more example where we will relight my face, which is again built around the shell. So there is an initial estimate of the geometry, and we have a shell around it. And this lets us preserve the thin details of my face, of the wig on my head. A scene with even more details is Chris's face, where there is a bunch of fine surface details. The mesh definitely does not capture that detail, but volumetric rendering does, and we are efficient because we just do volumetric rendering by getting very good samples inside the shell. Apart from our work, another notable work is adaptive shells, which came out in SIGGRAPH Asia last year, and similar ideas have also been explored around Gaussian splats. One of the recent works is Gaussian frosting, which just came out in ECCV 2024. Our method is AdaShell++, which is adaptive shells augmented with metric depth and other augmentations we just discussed. Our method AdaShell is not affected by noisy depth for view interpolation. To validate this claim, we perform the following experiment. We have two kinds of depth at our disposal. The first depth is the very smooth depth from deep learning to a stereo, and the second depth is this noisy depth that we captured by using semi-global matching stereo. We didn't do any fine-tuning on the parameters. We just wanted to see what is the effect of the noise. We took these two kinds of depth and we asked AdaShell++ to make a view interpolator for us. And surprisingly, we didn't see that much of a performance drop in PSNR corresponding to the view interpolation while we are using noisy depth or high quality depth. This was the result for the scene with the flat or like Lambertian pony or flat pony. However, when we had a somewhat specular object in the scene, our conclusions didn't change that much. At this point, you might be thinking, hey, there might be a catch. There is. So the catch is that the effectiveness of AdaShell is directly dependent on how good we are at estimating the current location of the surface. If the certainty in measuring the location of the surface is very high, we can have a thin shell. We can be really efficient in the sampling. When we have a noisy depth, the shells just become thicker and we drop the efficiency gain in the optimization process because we need to have a thick shell around the noisy depth and do a lot of samples to preserve the good parts of volumetric rendering. Okay. AdaShell++ can also be used for relighting. So you've already seen results on relighting Chris's face and my face. We have two more friends of mine whose face were relit. And we have two scenes where we have specular and a mixture of specular and diffuse objects. These are the performances of relighting. We didn't do a good job at relighting scenes where we had very specular objects. That is because apart from the stereo depth capturing really noisy depth, we didn't also do a good job at modeling the saturation of the camera when the flash fired on a white piece of cloth. I also should point out that apart from my face, all the images are missing the background. We reported the PSNR while the background was missing. That is because the volumetric rendering pipeline does not approximate a ray tracer. So if you're really carefully following the motion of the light and the shadow that I am casting on the background, you'll see that the shadows are incorrect. And this is what brings the PSNR down. So for these sequences, we report the PSNR with the shadow removed. Sorry, with the background removed, not the shadow removed. Okay. Since this is
sorry to interrupt there just for a second. Can you just spend like a few more sentences on where the big difference is of the volumetric render at the moment and like what happens there with the shadows and why?
Yes. Thanks for the great question. So if it were a proper ray tracer, so let's look back at the slide where we were looking at the geometry of the face. So for example, for my face, we do capture my nose in 3D, right? So if the network was approximating a ray tracer, there would be a shadow of my nose on my face. But this is a volumetric backend, and whatever shadow we see is whatever it learned by interpolating the training data. And that is not a good approximation of a true ray tracer. Therefore, the shadows that it casts is all incorrect. It's just some interpolation artifact. Therefore, it brings down the PSNR at test time, and we delete the shadows and report the PSNRs that way. In our paper, we also talk about the performance with the shadows with the background on, and we have a consistent 1.5 to 2 PSNR drop because of that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I just wanted to like segue into that there like for a moment, because I think even in the current case, the shadows that we see are very soft in the faces or like hardly present, and I'm surprised that that is what we see from the interpolation of the neural network. But I mean, it obviously very much depends on the data as it was recorded. So do you think that the positioning of the lights at the time like didn't even allow for proper shadowing to be recorded there?
Yes, that is also correct. These lights were very close to the camera, so there was not much shadows that was cast by my nose on my face. The most prominent shadow was me with the background.
Got it. And so
Yep.
now a little like extrapolating question here. Assuming that you had a more elaborate capture system here with many more lights, do you think it would be a good idea to do the shadow rendering purely through this in this data-driven way and through interpolation? And if not, like how do you see the, the space between a purely data-driven renderer and a ray tracer that takes the geometry into account?
So this is something which we can, so I actually have a backup slide on that as well, but this is something we can talk about later. My
All right,
experience.
Happy to do it later if that fits better.
Yeah, thank you so much. But please remember to ask this question again so that we can talk about it. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, let's look at the methods, our methods and baselines. So we have three baselines. Vol SDF++ is an augmented version of Vol SDF or baked SDF with the modifications that we have. Newest++ is a modified version of Newest or Neural Angelo. Unisurf++ is a deliberately hamstrung version of Unisurf, and we chose that to identify the effects of surface rendering versus volumetric rendering. Unisurf exposes a parameter which lets you bias the optimization process very aggressively towards surface rendering. And finally, AdaShell++ is our method, which was inspired by reactive shells, and this uses a depth to pre-calculate the sampling volume to accelerate training. All of our baselines, in a view constrained sense, perform well when the goal is just to do view interpolation. If we are very much biased towards surface rendering, as we did with Unisurf++, we fail to recover anything meaningful. And also, for a view constrained setting, if we remove the depth supervision, which leaves us with Vol SDF, we also fail to converge to a meaningful view interpolator. The summary of our results: all of Vol SDF++, Newest, and AdaShell can benefit from metric depth for view synthesis with a few views. AdaShell++ is significantly faster to train because the gradient steps are 10 to 15% faster. Oh, sorry. All the methods match or beat current state of the art in neural surface reconstruction, and AdaShell++ can use noisy depth with little impact on view synthesis. The shell just gets thicker, and we lose a lot on the training performance in terms of compute. Apart from all these algorithms, we also contribute a new data set, and I just wanted to take a moment to highlight the salient aspects that we capture. We are one of the few data sets which capture images with a flash, and I'm differentiating between flash and one light at a time by how far the light is placed from the camera. We do not provide an illumination model, but we do provide the location of the point light source with respect to the camera for all frames. And we are one of the few data sets which identify the location of depth edges and non-Lambert patches out of the box. And regrettably, we do not capture polarization images. Okay, let's look at the limitations. Yes, please.
The data set, so is this the base figures, or what exactly does this data set contain?
So Oliver is asking, what exactly does this data set contain? A very simple answer to that is, if you take our device and capture an object, you can make a data set out of it, and that will have these features.
Okay.
Doesn't have to be my face or the.
It's not a data set, it's a device.
It's a device. Yes. Sorry.
It's the wrong base.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that would have been a better way to phrase it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
From which you can capture another data set, yes.
So yeah, it is. Yeah. So I guess the better answer is it's just a device, not a data set. Okay. Yeah. Limitations. Hardware-wise, we use the pinhole camera model, which is not sufficient for the optics that we chose. That is because we have a significant amount of bokeh effect in the captured sequences. The background sharpness is lower, the foreground sharpness is higher. Fortunately, a recent work has come out which proposes a very simple modification to our pipeline that can alleviate this problem. The work is by Hua and colleagues, which came out in a civil paper workshop this year. We currently do not use raw images. However, Nerf in the dark might be a good starting point, and we currently do not handle highly specular reflections or other highly non-Lambertian effects. I believe that Pandora by Dave and colleagues, or Relatables work by Demovic and colleagues, which focus a lot on polarizing light light camera pairs can be a good starting point to address this effect. Okay, now let us take a look at another limitation. A fair question to ask is, since you have a robot-mounted camera system, you should be able to figure out a policy for the robot which moves around the scene and takes the most meaningful few views, right? That would definitely be better than just a hard-coded policy of where the robot moves and takes some images. We actually spent some time looking into that, and we found from the works of Sean and Jacobson is that the idea it would help a lot if we had a sensor noise model. And the sensor that we would base this on is the depth sensor. We have two kinds of depth sensors, or two modalities of depth that we captured. The first modality is just deep learning based stereo, which gives very nice locally smooth depth maps, but there isn't a noise model for this kind of depth in literature. We also have access to semi-global match disparities and depth from that. And there is a significant amount of literature which explores the noise models in semi-global match disparities. However, the quality of depth obtained by using semi-global matching disparities was so bad compared to the deep learning stereo that including that in our pipeline for view synthesis just for this task almost felt like taking a step back. So we didn't look at that problem in this project. The other thing I wanted to talk about is to answer Oliver's question. This is portable, but is this portable enough? Did we trade off too much portability in favor of captured modalities? And I'd like to draw parallels between, say, the most modern iPhone, which captures a single view image, and our system, which captures stereo pair and other associated quantities, but it is definitely not as portable and is definitely not a product. Currently, we have very high quality, very powerful monocular depth estimators, which gives us depth and normals, which almost always beats stereo match depth in quality. So it would be great if we can transfer the capabilities of our system into a portable platform and make it like a product, and that would make it truly portable. That would give us truly give us the best of both worlds. So Oliver, I think this was an answer to the question you asked in the beginning of the talk. Okay, with this, we are at the end of the main part of the talk, and I would like to take some time to look ahead and think about how the research that we did here can be effective for the computer vision and robot manipulation community in general. I'd start by looking at how we can add back some missing modalities into portable capture systems. The first modality that I want to add back is high quality metric depth from a monocular sensor. So let us take a look at this iPhone, which takes a high quality monocular image, and it also captures low resolution metric depth. My goal is to get high resolution metric depth from this sensor. We have very high quality segmentation models that gives us object level mask, and we also have very high quality monocular depth models. This just says, the label just says high quality monocular depth, which also gives us high quality monocular depth. So from our experiments, we observed that these monocular depth networks understand the scene in a per object level. So they are hallucinating the depth of the tile, the table, and then composing it back. So if we could mask out one part of the scene and focus our attention to that, we can solve this simple least squares problem to upgrade that part of the scene using high quality but non-metric molecular depth into metric high quality depth and plot it back into the scene. Another simple extension of this idea is we should be able to super resolve the depth captured using a stereo camera using monocular depth. It is the way to do it is very simple. We just recursively do what I just showed in the previous slide. We take every single object, segment them out, upgrade their depth from non-metric high quality monocular to metric depth, and plot it back in the scene. Like I mentioned before, monocular depth networks do not really have the limitation of stereo matching or something which can be a problem if there is cross-view consistency. If there is absence of cross-view consistency, because it understands or hallucinates the depth of the scene at an object level. So for scenes where stereo fails, monocular depth does not. However, the stereo is able to get some patches of the scene which is metrically correct because that is from disparities. So we can pick out those parts where the depth is correct, solve a robust least squares problem, and upgrade the scene full of shiny and transparent objects to a metric depth map, which a robot can use for a task. Improving a large stationary system is hard because it is already spec'd out with all the modalities that you can ever imagine. However, camera calibration is still a problem. So I would like to, using our system and the methodology, that machinery that we have developed, I would like to quickly prototype a camera calibration algorithm for a small human capture rig. And by small human capture rig, I mean the smallest possible human capture rig where I'm sitting in front of a stereo camera. We have the camera intrinsics, and the goal is to find out the pose of the camera from this. So I started with the easiest thing possible. I just gave the intrinsics and the images to a image from geometry network, which is AC0 in this case, and the depth that we recovered and the camera poses that we recovered were not as good. This is expected because AC0 is not designed to work with such low view diversity. Next, we turned our attention to a set of foundation models. We looked at depth anything V2, and SAM for segmenting the face, and LOFTR to match the segmented depth maps. There was a significant amount of warp in the depth maps, as you can see with the size of my nose and chin. And when we registered them together, the registration was not as good, and the camera poses were also not as good. Finally, we take a look at a foundation model that is custom built for this purpose. We look at the Sapiens model, and we take the monocular depths, and we use the facial markers that this foundation model gives us register. And this registration is qualitatively pretty good. We will look at quantitative results of this in the next slide. Okay, so before we look at the quantitative results, let's look at the gold standard we have, which is carefully registered stereo pairs. So we registered the stereo pairs until we optimized the registration process until we had a subpixel reproduction error. And then this was the registration error that we had for the scenes at hand. Like scene where I was wearing a wig, the RMSE for the registration was 2.93 and 1.81 for just the face, as compared to 9.11 and 12.49 while using Sapiens. Sapiens is not metric, but again, we use the same trick as before to upgrade Sapiens to metric. For now, we need careful stereo calibration because the error is almost an order of magnitude higher, but this was a quick prototype experiment, which gives me the hope that the foundation models that are coming out recently can help us solve classical computer vision tasks at scale. With that, I'm at the end of the talk, and I would like to leave you with these take-home messages. I hope that I was able to convince you that moving cameras and light in small scenes enables affordable, high-quality data capture. It also provides valuable insights into geometry and appearance of small scenes. Combining recent advances in 3D vision with classical techniques can guide future capture systems, and I strongly believe that the work we did here can serve as a strong foundation for this research. With this, I would like to complete my talk and finish by acknowledging my committee and funding sources. This research was funded in part by the National Science Foundation, the Toyota Research Institute. Thank you, Chris. Chris is my advisor. Thank you, Chris, for giving me all the support and freedom to pursue projects that I wanted to pursue. Thank you, Srinivas, especially for the third project, helping me out reach a computer vision audience. Thank you, Oliver, for the guidance I received from you in the initial parts of my PhD. I really appreciated our first semester research check-ins. Thank you, Christoph, for being so generous with your time and helping me forge connections outside academia. And finally, thank you, Andy, for his support in formulating the goals for the first and third projects. They are chronologically second and third, but I just presented them in that way. Okay, I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank my friends and family. So I'd like to start by thanking the folks from the Atkinson Lab. Mrinal Burgess is here. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Leo, for being really valuable sounding boards for my research ideas. And I also want to take a moment to thank Mrinal for getting the pastries for us today. So if you missed pastries, there are pastries over there. Okay. I'd also like to thank Professor Wenjin Yuan and the lab members of the erstwhile robotics lab to help me test out my materials in the initial part of my PhD. I also like to thank my family, my younger brother for being there with me always, and also like to thank my alphabetically ordered friend list. Anurag, Arpit, Ashwin, Akhil, Ben, Chase, Dorian, Kate, Suhail, Rishi, Sarvesh, Tejas, and Upsal. Thank you so much for being here.
That's all.
That's all. Yeah. I had like 20. All right, thank you so much.
Okay. The way we do questions is we start with the people furthest away. Christoph, do you want to start with questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Not sure whether I'm qualifying as furthest away today, but it sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would like to dive in right with a question that I mentioned during the talk. And yeah, would like to follow up there a little bit with your opinions about lighting computation, analytically data-driven, your experience there, and also your rationale there that you have and your extrapolation of where this could be going.
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking that question. So initially, when I started this research, when we were like figuring out what should be the light configuration, a really important question was put forward by Andy actually. Why not move lights and cameras independently? So we went back, and before we could implement a hardware setup for it, a paper came out, which is Relight My Nerve, where they put lights and cameras in separate manipulators. This led, I'm just giving a long answer so that hopefully all parts of the question are answered, by the way. So this generates this sequence of images where there are multi-view and multi-illumination images. And we followed their pipeline to implement neural view synthesizers, which take care of shadows completely using a volumetric renderer and no ray tracing or any approximation of the geometry whatsoever. After spending a significant time on that, we found that this sequence had limited number of views for the scenes, and this did not yield any useful 3D information, even when the network was converging or has converged or close to converging. We added back monocular depth and other things. We wrote to the authors saying, hey, do you have access to metric depth? And they did not. Therefore, I thought about so therefore, I thought that, okay, if we are trying to do shadows, maybe getting the object as a mesh and then ray tracing it would give us more simpler and better results than actually learning it in a totally data-driven way. So I think that is my answer. If I have to deal with shadows, I would first get the mesh or the geometry and then ray trace it rather than learn it in data-driven way.
Okay. I mean, let's zoom out there a little more. And I mean, shadows are just one type of hard occlusion that can happen that light interacts with matter in that volume that you try to characterize.
Yeah.
I think generally it's very interesting to consider the different options that we have to understand how light transfers through the volume and then interacts and then exits again. And data-driven is always great because we know exactly what we observe, but it has the problem with generalization and interpolation, and then like we're not it's much less clear that works well if we move out of distribution. And then on the flip side, it's great if we do this in analytic ways that are well understood and we optimize parameters for our models, and then we know how they generalize, but we might not be able to express them really well. And I feel that, you know, with your research and the work that you have put together, you move in a way where you can record more data than is possible in traditional static capture domes. And
Yes.
I just wonder how you think about this problem in this grander context. So shadows are like one effect that we're observing, but like can you zoom out there a little bit and tell us a little more about that?
So I guess so my answer to that is yes, there is definitely a lot of value in pursuing purely data-driven approaches. The way I formulated the problem was view constrained, and then when we added back data and added back depth, I saw that we didn't need that many views for the tasks we were mainly focusing. It's getting a view interpolator going on and getting the geometry correct. And beyond that, when we wanted shadows, like I said, I always defaulted to the conventional pipeline. But with that being said, I could have, you're definitely correctly pointed it out, I could have captured much more data to have a purely data-driven backend. having a purely data-driven backend with just volumetric rendering seemed to be too slow for any meaningful, like too slow for me so that I could meaningfully iterate a lot. But now Gaussian splats have come out, and there are even more impressive results using ray tracing approximate Gaussians in 3D. That might actually help cross this barrier, and maybe we will be able to use Gaussian splats with some other neural backends, which will take in massive amounts of data and understand shadows and all those things in a neural way and not in the conventional way. I think that is a frontier that remains to be explored by me. But for the task I put in front of myself, I think that was the path that I chose because it was the path of least resistance.
Okay.
Could I answer the question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I will wrap up with another question, then pass on to the next folks, not to use too much of the time, but this was like a more technical question. Like much earlier in your talk, you were talking, for example, about normals, and I also like asked a question about like the normals on that one particular slide, but you had more images of normals across your slides, and I saw that usually you computed those normals in analytic ways, just as the derivative of the depth. And that has all kinds of problems because noise, etc. Like it emphasizes all these things. I think technically in your setup and system, you would have different ways also like of obtaining depth if you wanted to do that in a data-driven way. Can you talk to that just in a couple of sentences?
Yes. So let me start by talking about what other normal capture modalities that we had looked at. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so before we thought about just getting normals as gradient of stereo depth, I tried to do intrinsic image decomposition, tried to have a light cap because the previous project was photometric stereo, so we had the machinery already with us. So I tried all those avenues, and unfortunately we didn't see a very high quality normal from any photometric signal when we had objects of mixed appearance, like something is not completely Lambertian, something is specular, stuff like that. However, we found that when we use high HDR, like high dynamic range images with some minor, like with a very simple tone map curve on it, and send it to a deep learning based stereo, it was surprisingly good at even taking in, say, specular objects and getting correct depth out of it. So I was impressed by the kind of depth that I got from as just gradient of normals, kind of normals that I got as gradient of depth from learning stereo using HDR. So I just settled on that and moved on. But yes, you are totally correct. There are other modalities in our system that we could have leveraged to get normals. But just depth from normals from depth as gradient worked out the best for me for the scenes I looked at.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, if you'd like to go next.
Sure, yeah. So Arka, in the beginning of your talk, you had motivated the ability to get high quality data for world models.
Yes.
And when I think about world models, I think about providing a sense of physical world understanding that allows the robot to better manipulate the objects or to better navigate, in some sense, make better decisions overall. And curious through these projects, there have been some that are very much focused on reproducing the fidelity of the world through the representation that you're capturing. And you did walk over very briefly an example of robots taking action after having a better representation. Could you walk over those examples again? I think it was like a suction cup example, and also more of your thoughts there, where you want to take this next.
Yes. So I am assuming that you're talking about this demonstration.
Yeah.
On a higher level, as I progressed in my research, I definitely started leaning more towards like purely computer vision research. And to me, then the term world model almost meant exclusively getting the best 3D model from the scene, and that's it. I didn't really think that much about how can we interact with the scene. So as you have pointed out correctly, interacting with the scene from after building a world model almost kind of took a pause after this project. And I didn't really think very seriously about it beyond this. Apart from that, are you asking about like the motivation of why I did this particular example, or was that a satisfactory answer?
Yeah, so I guess we'll say that in the extensions of the works, you had started probing more towards at a high level towards being able to construct better, higher fidelity representations of specular surfaces. So like the wet hand example is a great one.
Yes.
And part of that, what are the applications that you had in mind when being able to produce some of the results there? Is it for is it better rendering for graphical applications, or is it so that a robot can detect specular surfaces and it knows if something is slippery, or yeah, what's the goals there?
Yes, thank you so much for asking this question. Chris has asked this exact same question to me many times. For this particular demonstration, my goal was just as simple as, can we get a 3D model of this scene, which is challenging for a conventional computer vision pipeline. And we took a bunch of data, we processed it, and we got to a mesh model, which you can relight. Beyond that, when I tried to draw some parallels between a portable capture system and how that can help us image using fusing classical and modern computer vision techniques. This is the only extension that I thought about when I thought, how can my work extend beyond pure computer vision into robotics? Yes, there is definitely a use case of a robot understanding which part of the scene is wet and which part of the scene is slippery. And regrettably, I didn't spend that much time thinking deeply about it beyond just the capture system we developed and how that can identify shiny parts of the object. I didn't think about how we can infer if that is slippery. I didn't think about how, if it is wet, should we interact or not, those kind of logical questions.
With the examples of the wet hand, you might have covered it, but I may have missed it. Is it where do you get ground truth, or how's the evaluation done? Is it based on qualitative samples and A is better than B, or yeah, how is that done there?
Yes, thanks for asking the question. So for the wet hand demonstration, the slide which I just showed you, that was completely qualitative. In the back end, when I was the most meaningful quantitative experiments that I could do is I have 12 lights, so I can train the relighting with 6 lights and test it on 6 lights and report PSNRs. That is what I did here. So I don't remember the PSNR numbers from the top of my head for that, but sorry, I don't remember the PSNR numbers from the top of my head for that, but it is in this ballpark. So that is the only quantitative result that I can tell you from the top of my head regarding the wet hand or the oily hand experiment.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think that overall concludes the questions that I've had so far. I can hand it off to the next person.
Srinivas?
Oliver was,
I'm technically further along.
Okay, you guys sort it out.
So I have a couple of just like I guess details or maybe even high level questions. So the first part is, so the overall storyline was sort of this was portability, right?
Yes.
The last project, so that was moving camera, moving light. Were you actually moving the camera?
So yes, it's a great question. So for the demonstration Jesus showed, where for the face captures and all, I didn't mount the camera on the robot and then move it in front of somebody's face, because that is risky. But because it is a lot to ask to sit in front of a camera with things moving. It's also very bright. But for small scenes, I did actually get those sequences. I didn't show the sequences, but for small scenes, I did get those sequences by just zipping around the robot. And in fact, if you remember my old proposal talk, we had that system running then, where we let's see, where this was basically the capture pipeline that we were running, where we were moving lights and cameras this way. I didn't emphasize it in this talk, but this system still exists.
So you're not really using motion. It's not really.
So by motion, by moving cameras, I just said moving from point A to point B and logging what the pose is. There is no data that has been captured during that intermittent motion. So it is like a much like very conservative definition of motion, yes.
You mentioned also that you're collecting sort of like you're figuring out like where like the speculative portion of the scene.
Yes.
Are you using that in the final pipeline?
So Oliver is asking, are we using the specularity labels at all? We are using the specularity labels, but they are not very much like overwhelmingly useful. So let me explain what I mean by that. So let's see. So for this slide, we would identify that this is where the specular objects are. Now I know that this scene has something specular in it. So when I do that, when I get the depth using deep learning based stereo, deep learning based stereo will actually fail on this sequence. So what I would do is I would go back, mask out these parts where we know they're non-Lambertian and paint it with some other color. So there is some hyperparameters that I have is very hard coded where I just say where the image that is sent off to the stereo matcher looks something like this aluminum plate is in like red or blue or something with the texture. And that lets it get the depth correctly and doesn't fail. That was the same, this was the case also when I was looking at my wet hand. So what would happen is, let's see. So here there's a wet patch here, right? So if I let the stereo just go at it, it's going to capture a hole or a spike in that wet patch. What I would do is, since I captured the specular label there, or non-Lambertian label there, I would just go back, fill that in, because I know this scene has specular, so I just switch on that option, fill that in, and then the stereo does not fail there, and we get like a decent depth where there are no holes here. This was the biggest use of that. And finally, when I'm learning the appearance, there's a neural BRDF that is going on. So basically, it is a neural network, which when you tell what part of the scene you're looking at, it gives out the BRDF parameters, which you can use to get the appearance. That's just a neural network. So when I'm training the neural network, I found that for specular parts of the scene, it takes a little bit more samples. So like before, I just focus, like when I know where the specular pixels are, after the training has say progressed 90%, I just exclusively focus on the specular thing so that they get more gradient steps to figure out what the appearance is. Was that okay? Good.
So for the pipeline, for the pipeline, you know, there, so you have these three sort of additions to it and like three different insights and like how to improve it. I was just kind of wondering, you know, how method specific is this? Like, I mean, I hear a lot now about like Gaussian splatting, for example, like, can you use the same insights there, or does that sort of, you know, just change some of the problems?
Yes. So Oliver is asking the question, how method specific are these modifications? And would it work in Gaussian splatting? So let me break this question down into first part. How method specific is this? So generally speaking, Gaussian splatting is a little bit different than neural radiance fields philosophically. So when we are looking at neural radiance fields, it will generally have the following moving parts, where there is going to be a network which is trying to understand the geometry. There's a different network which is trying to understand the appearance. As long as, and it will definitely have a single loss which takes care of all the things, and it will have volumetric rendering to train the whole thing together. And volumetric rendering would need sampling. So for all the classes of the networks, which basically does this, our methods work. Therefore, implementing those baselines, those 4 baselines was reasonably simple. It just fit in. Now, to answer the Gaussian splatting question, let me show you a quick picture. Let's see. Oops. So for the Gaussian splatting thing, let me show you. Okay, let me maybe not my face. Maybe this one. So when we are training a Gaussian splatting model, it would be really good if we can supply it with very good initial estimates. And by very good initial estimates, I'm not talking about just point clouds with like uniform covariances. Also, the covariance is warmed up. What I can do is if you start with depth maps or geometry, and you have a good color also, you can actually do some clustering to get a very good initial estimates of what the Gaussians are. And that should also be good starting point for this pipeline. I'm actually working on this right now, and hopefully I'll be able to make something meaningful out of it and archive it soon. But hope that was meaningful, sir. Yeah, okay.
And I guess maybe one last question. So you started off by talking about like supermarkets and agricultural robotics, and I'm still trying to kind of really go back and question, like trying to understand like what the applications are, like what can we now do in those two domains that we couldn't do before?
That's a fantastic question. So Oliver asked the question, what can we now do in supermarkets and in an orchard that we could not do before? Honestly, I just took motivation from those. I didn't really think about backtracking use cases from my work to that. If you need to build a 3D model of a small object from a limited number of views, I have a solution for that. But beyond that, I didn't really think that much about how can you interact with the fruit in a tree. We have a way to measure depth edges that may be helpful if you want to segment leaves or something. That was the original use case of the multi-flash, one of the original use cases of the multi-flash camera. But beyond that, I didn't really think about what insights can we use from here that will port to an orchard or a supermarket.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of applications, I feel like if you just focus on people, right?
Yes.
People, faces, and the body or something, right? That's the kind of size you're looking at. So my question is, if you think about Paul Debevec's capture, he took his rig to Obama's White House and captured his face, right? And you took your rig and captured Chris's face.
No, Chris was in the lab, but yes.
Well, both are equally famous, is what I'm trying to say. The question is, would this be a better system than whatever Paul Debevec did to capture the face? So yeah, all of these very elaborate things that have been developed, right? This is how you started your talk. At least for faces, or maybe busts or whatever, is this a better system?
So.
And why, if it is?
I don't know if this is a better system or not, but I can talk about some insights that I have, which may make it a useful choice, because I don't have results to show. So one idea which I had in my mind was, can I have a rig which I can take home with me, and that would look at my face while I make a bunch of face gestures and make a personalized rigging model for me, so that I can have like a virtual telepathic avatar here. I don't know why the optic flow demo is not working here. I think I have set you the
But your current system doesn't handle dynamic things, right?
It is capable of. We just didn't use that.
Your lighting has to be moving fast enough.
Yes,
right?
it has to be. That shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
But yeah, it's going to be. I mean, at the risk of hurting my contribution, it is going to be really painful for the subject. But because the lights are really bright, they're 80 watts apart. So it's going to be really painful if you have to sit in front of the thing. But we should be able to capture data from video, no problem. We have the machinery for that.
So you haven't answered my question.
Oh, sorry.
Which is a better system? Yours or Paul Debevec's?
Dollars for PSNR, probably mine would be better.
Okay.
But again, the problem is that the PSNR tapers off, right? So maybe I will be really good for dollars for PSNR till say 27, but from 27 to 35, this is definitely not a match, because fundamentally the resolution of my system and the modalities that I capture is nowhere close to what Debevec captures.
Well, you use a bigger, resolution camera and all of that. That's fine, but I think the form factor is attractive, right?
Yes.
I don't want that big ring.
Yes,
I'm pretty sure Obama didn't care for that, right?
Yes, there is. I mean, I actually started to think about that, and the most concrete thought I had is like, it would be great if I could have a capture rig for myself, which will just take care of my face gestures. But I'm hesitant to say that it would be better than, say, a dedicated capture rig like one which Meta has or one which Paul has, just because just because of the quality of results, like I've seen the results there and I've seen the results myself, and I think there is a significant improvement that has to be done
Well, is
before.
it because of diversity of the illumination angles, or what?
Yeah,
There is a reason they've made it big, right?
yes. They have,
Why is it big?
so views, the number of views, view diversity actually solves many problems.
Well, most of the initial things were all lighting diversity, it was just one camera up front.
Dimmel's gradient illumination gives you normals just from the illumination gradient, but it also has multiple views. So if I look at the relatables, it has, just to capture raw depth, it has 24 like active stereo systems. So that is like not like one stereo system for me, but that is an active stereo system which is like spread around the captured dome, and that gives you depth, high resolution depth of the scene really really well. So that would be the first hurdle that I would have to go up of, like, we need very good depth at very high resolution. My resolution, I capture, say, at 1536 by 1536, and the best stereo network, open source stereo network that I have my hands on is happy to match about 800 by 800, and beyond that, some interpolation effects come in and there are some errors. That was one of the reasons why there are some errors in the conventional stereo matching registration also. To increase the performance of my rig, the first modification that I would do, if I have to keep the form factor intact, is I would switch to high resolution cameras, and maybe having, like, that is why I said the iPhone may be an attractive choice, because it is really good if I have a co-located low resolution metric depth sensor with a high resolution monocular image. That way I can offload the depth calculation, the meat of the main part of the depth calculation, to the monocular network, and then I can take parts of the scene, upgrade them to metric, so that registration and all those things are immediately better. That is one of the reasons why I also pointed out the iPhone result demonstration. But that is what I would like do. Like, if I have to change this, I would probably strap in, say, 2 iPhones together with some lights, and then that would be the version 4 of this capture rig. Could I answer your question? Okay.
Now, you said something about, hey, dynamic scenes you can do. Is that something that is more?
I did not.
Just a question of synchronized fast cameras and lights, or is it something more?
As far as I'm aware, synchronizing a bunch of cameras with, say, Genlock or something is not that hard. So looking at a dynamic scene wouldn't be that much.
No, you have to change the light.
Yes.
While you're doing the action, right?
Yes, that is also has to be figured out. But just the camera with like, if I don't worry about light.
All I'm asking is, can you tell me, if I had to, you showed me a video of you doing your PhD.
Yep.
But you have to also change the lighting.
Yes.
What would you need for that? What would you need to do there?
Hardware wise, I would need to revamp the whole light flashing system, because right now it is not. I mean, do you want me to get into technicalities here, or?
Just what are the big challenges?
Hardware wise, I need to have a separate driver for the lights. I just use the most simplest driver. It is not even it doesn't even have a capacitive bank or anything. It just flashes lights and stuff like that. That would be the first challenge. The second challenge would be these lights. I actually removed the slide because anyway, so these lights, they don't talk back to the camera. So I would need light to camera communication so that the camera knows that the flash has fired. These are all common hardware that you can buy, just not at this scale with a tractable price. So if I have that, I could probably have like maybe 6 or 12 lights, which are talking back to the camera. The cameras are synced together, and then I can basically record data at whatever speed my hard drive can write at.
So you would have 12 lights and you wanted 30 frames per second, you would need a 30 times 12 frames per second camera.
Yes, you need a 30. So, I mean, I have never done that engineering for 26 images. It was reasonably fast for me, but maybe we can distribute the capture from 2 of the cameras. But again, I never gave a solid thought about what exactly hardware updations that I need to incorporate.
So let's say that you had only 30 frames per second camera.
Yes.
The flashes go fast. What can you do?
We can probably, so Srinivas is asking, what if we had a 30, I forgot to repeat the question. Srinivas asked, what if we had 30 frames per second camera and the flashes were moving, what can we do with the data? We should be able to do something similar to what Meta is doing right now, where they have multi-illumination rig, multi-illumination captures of faces, and they can relight it with different kinds of illumination. Because at that end, we are actually capturing a lot of good data really fast, right? It is not increasing anything apart from the quality, apart from the quantity of the data. Yeah, and we are like tracking the face, and then it's insane amount of data that needs to be processed for that. But tracking the face and for this particular gesture with that particular light, what is the effect? All those things. I mean, at that end, then we're approaching, say, a commercial face capture rig, which say Disney or somebody has. I just wanted to, like, one of the reasons why I settled with this is because I just wanted to look at static scenes and didn't really think about those things. But these are definitely very important questions. Yeah, very valuable questions.
Okay, let Chris go.
Chris, you're up.
I've had plenty of opportunity to ask questions, so I'm going to forego asking questions. Does anyone in the audience have questions?
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Cool. So I think similar to Srinivas's question really, but a slightly different way. So when you move a camera, when you move the lights, you're injecting a lot of information into the scene for which you're then trying to reconstruct the object, right?
Yes.
You're also coming out with these foundation models which have very strong bias. So really, how much information do you need to add? How many lights do you really need? How far do you actually need to move the camera? Because if you can answer that, then you're getting to the question, why is this better? What can I do that I haven't done before?
Now the question is a little bit more clear. So let me reattempt just to answer your question. So when I was making the Sapiens demo, what I observed is that if you show it a say multi-flash pair where there is a significant amount of specular highlight, it actually gets the depth some incorrect in the forehead where it's very shiny, right? But when I fed in just normal, like with HDR images with like flat light in the room, it performed very well. So at the very least, I found a breaking point where if you blast the scene with a lot of light, maybe that is too much out of distribution for these foundation models and it doesn't really work out. So if I have to, I mean, that can be a point where we start thinking about like where a foundation model would fail and stuff like that. But if you're capturing the multiple flash images with my face, yeah, maybe and the backend is maybe a foundation model like Sapiens or something like that. It will definitely fail in some interesting ways. So the first hurdle would probably be recovering from that failure to get something meaningful in terms of geometry, and then moving on to that. This was one of the reasons also why I chose stereo, because initially did some research on using monocular depth for all the reconstruction and all. And I found it really hard to get monocular depth work for all scenes reliably across the board. So that was also a failure case. So if I have to like switch to what Srinivas suggested, that would be the point that would be the thing I would rectify first. Was that okay? Good. Any other question?
Leo has a question on Zoom.
Yes, Leo has a question. Hey, Leo. Leo has a question. Leo.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Good talk. In a lot of this, you fused many different data sources, right? You had multiple light illuminations, you had multi-camera. You can imagine going even further with, as you mentioned, monodepth just now, to multispectral cameras, to something like Dream Fusion that imagines a mesh out of nothing. So is there any hope for kind of automatic selection of which of these sources are reliable at different points? That is to say, so you don't have to manually say, oh, monodepth seems to be failing on this scene. Do you ever see any reliable signals where you could actually decide which data inputs are working for that reconstruction versus which ones are unreliable? Because it seems that from computer vision, we have a long history of many, many different cues you could continue incorporating to get better reconstruction. So I guess my question is there any hope for automatically selecting which ones seem to be working for that scene versus just you sitting there and deciding yourself?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I didn't give a solid thought about automatic, model or method selection / rejection. What I found was valuable was ensuring that getting the depth, getting high quality depth was crucial. Sorry, it's a convoluted answer. So as long as I ensured that we are getting high quality depth, that actually helped me. And we can get high quality depth from monocular depth upgraded, or from monocular depth only, or from stereo. But for all my experiments which worked, we just figured out a way to get high quality depth, and that was a good starting point. So an answer to your question might be, if a pipeline fails when we are, if pipeline fails to yield high quality depth out of the bat, maybe not proceed with that. That is something which I very strongly believe. But apart from that, it also probably depends on what kind of demonstration that you are targeting. If you want to have a relatable scene, maybe start with a very strong geometric backend and then add on the appearance parameters and then relight it. If you want to have a generative AI aspect to it, maybe include a generative AI model, which say fills in some missing views and stuff like that. So Dream Fusion might be a direction you want to pursue. But if I have to rule out models or pipelines, I would just start by seeing who gives the best depth, or if somebody fails at giving depth, they need to be rolled out. Was that, did I answer your question then?
Yeah. I mean, funneling through geometry is, that makes sense to me. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please.
You mentioned how interpretable are your results? You mentioned having metric depth is important. What about for the appearance parameters and the lights? Are you measuring material parameters in real units? Is there just an arbitrary scale factor for your lights?
So Ian is asking, are we measuring the material parameters in real units, or is it arbitrarily scaled? The answer is it is arbitrarily scaled, because this is a neural BRDF, and when we want to extract the texture, we just plot that texture to the mesh and we bake it out as texture. So when I'm rendering it using, say, Blender, I have to spend a significant amount of time guessing what would be the linearizing scale for, say, specularity or roughness or something like that. This is definitely not an absolute scale. One thing that can be done is if I had, say, a mesh-based renderer in the loop, and that had a scale which it which it wants by default, we can freeze that scale and have that in the loop, and that can alleviate this difficulty. But for me, it was thought in hindsight. So when I showed the demonstrations behind that, I had like 15-20 minutes just toying with the parameters to see what looks better. Could I ask you a question? Okay. Any other question?
Actually, let's start the committee meeting.
Okay.
So everybody leaves except the committee. You stop recording, and